I'm going to talk a little bit today about a program that we developed that's really kind of aimed at for our county educators. And just to kind of, we've already been talking about this. I won't, why are we talking about housing right now? We've already kind of hammered that. But kind of started this off today, kind of talking about this housing research group or whatever we're calling ourselves. And what was it? 2018 that we first started talking. One of the things that struck me is in those early discussions amongst us extension colleagues is that folks were kind of realizing the housing was an issue, but we didn't really have any kind of programming related around housing. We didn't really kind of have a housing program, if you will. So a lot of the county educators were really struggling in terms of, well, I see a need, but how do I respond? And we don't have a housing specialist in extension, so we didn't really have anybody that we kind of turn to say, provide us with some leadership here. So that's one of the reasons that the group kind of has been meandering a little bit, is because we were kind of all wanted to kind of get involved and wanted to kind of help move the process forward a little bit, but it was kind of, my plate's already full, I can't take a leadership role in this. So one of the things that we wanted to try to do with this was to develop I hope this thing's not on a timer, is to kind of build a program that could be kind of off the shelf. So that county educators had a program that they could work with individual communities. And the way that we move forward with this is to kind of build off of the experiences of Glenn Pulver and Ron Schaefer and the Extension Community Economic Analysis Program, or the CEA program that they developed in the 1980s. The program is really aimed at helping communities identifying economic objectives and strategies that the community wished to pursue. They developed this after the early recession, the early 1980s. Wisconsin got hit really, really hard in that recession. It was kind of double-edged. One, there was the farming crisis, and then there was also structural shifts in manufacturing. So Wisconsin got hit really hard, and there was a need to do something. So this is a program that Ron and Glenn developed, and they ran it in over several dozen communities throughout the 1980s and 1990s. And so we're kind of using this as a kind of a framing point. So the original CEA was composed of 3 working sessions, about 90 minutes each. So 3 workshops. And the first one was really kind of aimed at talking about economic data to really better understand the strengths and weaknesses of the local economy. To kind of engage the community in a conversation about what is happening to the economy, what is within their control, what is outside of their control. The second session was really kind of a discussion of economic development strategies to try to get communities to think a little deeper about what they could do to affect their community. This was a time period when everybody thought that economic development was essentially manufacturing recruitment. We want to recruit a manufacturing firm. That's our economic development strategy. So Glenn and Ron were on a mission from God to basically kind of say, no. That's not how communities can move forward. Okay. The third session was really a development of specific community goals and outcomes and the strategies to pursue and achieve those outcomes. Okay, so essentially this is kind of coming up with an action plan. What does the community want to address? How are they going to address it? And how are they going to move forward? The county educator essentially provided continuous follow-up work with the community for the next 16 to 24 months. Ron and Glenn would actually have the county educator sign a contract. It's a non-enforceable contract, so why bother signing it? But basically saying this is something that you really have to kind of commit your time to. So these are kind of some of the classics that came out of the original Community Economic Analysis program. The kind of Community Economic Analysis how-to manual that was kind of has become kind of the go-to for basic economic analysis of your local community. Rethinking economic development strategies. This is, I refer to it as the gospel according to Glenn, essentially moving away from recruiting manufacturing firms as economic development. No, there's lots of other things that we can do. And then the third one is kind of for the kind of community thinking about how it wants to move forward is force field analysis, which is a very useful tool to kind of identify what do we want to accomplish, how are we going to accomplish it, what are the things that are going to be barriers, what are things that are going to help us, and how are we going to move forward. They would say that the most powerful thing out of this, it is on a timer, sorry about that, is at the bottom, people would actually sign their name to it. And they would commit to actually working on that particular strategy. Their logic is that if nobody's willing to sign up for it at the end, then clearly it isn't that important of an issue. And there's a bit of a peer pressure that when you sign your name to something, you're kind of setting up expectations that you're going to follow through on that. So these are some of the old classic tools that we can maybe build on and use. Today, there's a number of these community economic analysis programs. There's the Take Charge program. There's the SET program. The SET program, how many of you heard of the program that Wood County went through 2 years ago? Something like that, maybe 3 years ago? That was essentially the SET program. Then there's other types of community visioning programs. Norm Walser put together a really nice book on this. And this is actually something that we're going to be using when we work with some smaller communities across Wisconsin with a project that we have with WEDC. Okay, so there's kind of a tradition here of how we go about doing some of the strategic planning and strategic thinking. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to take this kind of a logic, this kind of framework, and adapt it to housing. Okay, so issues to think about. Is the community asking or talking about housing issues? Okay. Is the housing CEA an appropriate tool? It is but one tool. Is it the right tool? The second, identify 10 to 12 members of the community willing to devote time to the project or the program. Okay. Broad cross-representation of the community to be involved in this. As we've been talking about this morning, one of the keys to housing issues is access to finance. So it makes sense that you probably want to have the bankers part of that process. Okay. You also want to have the major anchor institutions, the local major businesses part of this process. Why? Because they carry political weight. Okay. The first session, the data overview. What does the data on housing tell us within a local context? Okay, and this is where we're grounding in data. We have more data than we know what to do with. And when working with the community, it's really kind of a balancing act between providing enough information that they can make an informed decision and overwhelming them and drowning them in too much data. Okay. Okay, and this is where I've been struggling as I put this together, because as an economist, I think it's un-American not to use all the data at your disposal. Okay? Now, when I do that, I end up with a set of a slide deck of graphics that's about that thick. You know that's not going to work in a community. So this is where a lot of the art comes into it. Okay. The second session is to review strategies for housing. What we developed here was a housing preparedness index, and I'll walk through that in a little bit. And then the third session is to facilitate a group discussion to identify 4 plus or minus actionable items for the community to work on. Okay. And then provide follow-up support as the community moves forward. Okay. This is an example of some of the data, and I actually cut a lot of the graphics out of this particular report that we put together as a starting point. And you're going to see that a lot of the data that's in this, we've already been talking about. Do you still use this thing, or have you thrown it away? Or you put it up on a bulletin board and throw darts at it? Okay. This you've already seen. This is essentially all transaction housing prices, okay? This is Wisconsin in the US, and you can kind of see, I mean, that's kind of the definition of a perfect bubble. I mean, you kind of see it shoot up off the long-term trend line, it explodes, it pops. The question is, are we going into another one? Indeed, one of our previous presenters actually had the most current data, and when you look at the most recent year, there's a real spike up. Okay. The question is how sustainable is that? So this is kind of bottom line, is that what's happening to housing prices? Housing is getting more expensive. Okay. We have this data for every county in Wisconsin. So we could actually not talk in terms of Wisconsin or the US, but we can talk about individual counties. And we can kind of say, what is the data trying to tell us here? Okay. This is one that I've always found fascinating, is that when you look at the number of new single-family home building permits per 1,000 people, if you look prior to the Great Recession, there's kind of this equilibrium level of new housing permits being offered or being issued, okay? And so that's kind of the new supply of housing that's coming online. You can see kind of evidence of the oversupply leading up to the Great Recession. The Great Recession came in, and notice that we haven't really come back, okay? Why haven't we returned to the pre-Great Recession levels of new housing coming online? Okay, we could spend all day talking about that, and we've already been talking about that a little bit. The idea behind this is to get the community thinking about some of the issues that are at play. Okay, again, we have this for all the counties in Wisconsin. We have this for all the counties in the US. Okay, this is for Wisconsin. It's a little bit more detailed. This is new private housing units built by building permits. That's the blue line, that's the total, and then the number of private housing single units. So the difference here would be multifamily housing units, okay? But again, the same kind of a pattern, okay? Other types of things that we want to talk about is kind of, what percent are home occupied and what percent are renter occupied? We were talking before about what's the benchmark, what's the appropriate level of rental versus home occupied, and the number 30 came up, 30%. Well, this essentially allows Osakie County to compare itself to some comparable places. And we purposely picked not places immediately around Osakie County, because Osakie County is part of a larger housing market. Okay, we wanted to pick counties that were farther away, so that you can actually see some independence there, okay? So that 30%, maybe that's not such a bad benchmark number, okay? Now, we also have this data for each individual place within Osakie County. So not only are we looking at the county, but we can actually go and look at individual municipalities within the county to get some different ideas here, okay? The number of single family units detached, multiple units. I'm not sure what's the difference between one unit detached and a one unit attached. I'm not sure what that difference is. And I still haven't been able to find it in the census. Shared wall. Shared wall? Okay. I can't find the definition in the census. Okay. But the idea here is that you can start to see that in Wisconsin and in these counties, the vast majority are single, that's that Cape Cod house on a quarter-acre lot with a white picket fence. Okay, but there's also other levels of different types of housing units that are available. Okay, and again, we can do the same thing looking at individual municipalities within the county. In this one, we also, I don't know, did we put in mobile? Yeah, mobile homes is in there, okay? So again, we can kind of have this to start a conversation within the county, okay? How old is the housing? Okay, so the percent built before 1939. And again, this is a graphic that we've already seen. This essentially can tell you what is the age of the housing stock. Now, one thing is the number of housing built before 2010 or later. That's the new housing stock that's coming online. And you can notice that it's a relatively small share. Okay, again, a way to start a conversation with the community. And again, we can do it for each individual municipality. Okay, how long have people been living in their current homes? What's the churn? Okay. There's a natural churn rate of housing moving over, people moving in, moving out. What is that natural churn rate? And how long have people been staying in their particular house? this gives you an idea of kind of what that churn rate looks like by how long they've been living in a particular house. Okay, so having housing coming out of the market, going off the market is part of a natural churn. Again, we can look at this by individual communities within Ozaukee County. Okay, now one of the things that we want to talk about is housing stress. And when we talk about housing stress, there's two ways to think about housing stress. One is the quality of the house. Okay, now the problem though is in Wisconsin, when you start looking at some of the traditional measures of housing stress, the percent that lack complete plumbing, the percent that lack complete, this, that, and the other, right? When you look at the map of counties in Wisconsin or the upper Midwest that has high housing stress, and then you put the map of recreational housing next to that, the overlap is amazing. That's not crappy housing, that's a hunting cabin. So we have a really hard time using these data to talk about the quality of the housing side. Okay, so we've kind of just punted on it. Okay, but what we do have is good data on fiscal stress. One of the traditional measures is this ratio between your median income and the value of your house. Okay, and the traditional ratio is about 3. So if your income is, say, $50,000, the value of your house should be about $150,000. Okay, when you're a first-time home buyer, you go in and you talk to the banker, you talk to a real estate agent, that's what's your gross income, and then they kind of tell you what is the simple ways. They multiply by 3 and say that's the housing range that you should be in. Okay. So what we do with this is that we essentially put in median income, median house value, and then we take the ratio of it. Ozaukee County, that ratio is above 3. Okay, so we could say that housing is stressed, fiscally stressed in Ozaukee County. The median price of housing is higher than median income by more than a factor of 3. Okay, but there are some counties, St. Croix. I think if we redid this with more current data, that might change because of the effect of the Twin Cities coming over. Allegheny doesn't look that bad. Salt County's kind of high. Walworth County's kind of high. But we can start a conversation about what do we mean by housing stress. Okay. We can do this for the individual communities within the county. And again, there's a couple that kind of pop out. But generally, based on these measures, there's not that much housing stress, fiscal housing stress in Ozaukee County, given median values and median income. Okay, but again, these are broad averages. Okay, another way to look at it is the percent of your expenditures on housing. Generally, if you're spending more than 35% of your income on housing, you're kind of in fiscal stress when it comes to housing. So when we look at this, we can look at housing units with a mortgage, the percent that are spending more than 35%, the percent of housing without a mortgage. You still see a number, there's still housing costs beyond a mortgage, like insurance, property taxes, things like that. And then the percent of units paying rent, 35% or more. The takeaway for me for this is that in Wisconsin, the housing stress is not necessarily from the homeowner's perspective, but it's from the rental market's perspective. The real stress is in the rental market. Okay, so this kind of helps the community start thinking beyond simply home ownership and thinking about the rental markets. Okay, again, we can break it down by individual municipalities within the county. Okay, now this is where, how many slides did we have in the final report? We must have had what, 60 slides, something like that, different ways of cutting the data.
Yeah, there were.
It's just, it's too much.
Yeah.
It's too much. Way too much data, and this is only using the census data. This doesn't even count into the, what is it? Who's the competitor still? Right. We've got that data. That's Redfin. Thank you, Redfin. I just downloaded all that data. Oh my God, we're drowning in data. Okay, so that gets the community kind of thinking about the housing market in the local community. The second session is to talk about housing strategies. Okay, so Karina and Carl and I kind of hold ourselves up in a room in the basement of the Powell Center, and we essentially tried to develop what's called a housing preparedness index. And what this is a series of questions that we can walk through with the community. Okay, for example, we have a comprehensive plan in place that identifies our vision of the community. Yes or no, don't know. Why would you want to ask that? It's a way to kind of spark a conversation within the community about different things that they should be thinking about. Okay. If you don't have a comprehensive plan in place that identifies the future vision of the community, it's really hard to talk about housing without that as a reference point. So maybe if the answer is no, maybe the starting point is not to talk about housing, but we need to take a step back and think about the community in a broader context. Okay, and then there's just a whole range of potential questions that we can ask. Okay, this is just a couple of the examples that are blown up a little bit easier to read. This is actually in your handouts. Okay, so the idea then is that we can actually kind of walk through and address each one of these questions and then have a conversation about, you know, why are we asking, why is this important? Okay. Existing housing codes and policies. It's amazing to me how many rural Wisconsin communities do not have a housing code. Okay, so you know they complain about the quality of the housing stock. They have nothing on the books that allows them to do it. Okay, so it kind of creates an opportunity. Well, the second one, we vigorously enforce our housing code. Okay, a couple of times to encourage property owners to upgrade or to sell poorly maintained property. Yeah, we got a code, but we don't enforce it. Well, what could just have in the code? Okay, a way to engage in this kind of a conversation. Okay, we have revised or streamlined the development review and rezoning process. If you have a developer that comes in and says, I want to do something, how easy is it to be able to go through that process for that developer? Or a homeowner comes in and says, hey, I want to do this. How easy is it for you to go through that process? Local capacity to address housing issues. We have a local public nonprofit and or public-private partnership charged with developing affordable housing. Greene County. Is there a group out there? And I think this is from your comments. This is what you're struggling with. Okay. So we ask these questions essentially saying, okay, who's kind of taking leadership in this? Is there anybody taking a leadership in this? Okay. There are transitional housing available for people moving from homelessness to permanent housing. Okay, this gets into affordable housing. Okay. The community has a land trust program. Why would we want a land? What's a land trust? Why would we want to have a land trust? Right? This is Carl. Carl can explain this better than I. What is a potential strategy that a community can adopt? So essentially, it's a way to set aside land for future development. We regularly apply for state resources. We regularly apply for state and federal community development grants to help us in the aid in addressing housing issues. There's a ton of grant money out there. Are you tapping into some of this grant money to be able to help you to address some of these issues? Okay, we have the resources to fund local home repair loan and grant programs. We've got plenty of housing, but it's really crappy housing. Do we have a program in place that we can help the homeowner to actually maybe do improvements on their house? I think we just talked this morning that Eau Claire has a program like that. Okay. The community has a down payment assistance program for first-time home buyers. What's that? Why would we want to think about maybe having something like that in place? Again, what we've got here is essentially a laundry list of potential strategies that the community can invoke. So, third meeting, take action. Facilitated process to identify 3 to 5 actionable items. Okay, what are we going to work on? Okay, we did this in, we pilot tested this in Sauk Prairie And one of the actual items they came up with is that there's an existing program out there to help homeowners that need low interest loans to do maintenance, deferred maintenance on their housing. Nobody knew about the program. How can people take advantage of this program if nobody knows about it? So they went to the local utility company and said, hey, would you insert this flyer in your next billing cycle? That's not very complicated. Okay. Revisit existing building codes, enforcement policies, gather additional information. Okay, kind of simple things. Well, maybe we need to go and rethink our building code. Okay, our enforcement policies or the lack of enforcement policies. Okay, maybe we need to gather additional information. Okay, now this is a trap because there's so much data that's available about housing, is that it's possible for the community to fall in the trap of paralysis by analysis. We just keep studying it. We just keep studying it. We just keep studying it. And it's kind of almost like an excuse to not do anything. Okay. And because we have so much data, we can do that. Okay. Develop an action and implementation plans and match local capacity with identified needs. Okay. Follow up, and follow up. Okay. This is where the county extension educator can play a critical role in terms of not only facilitating and organizing, but also kind of being that cheerleader to kind of keep the community moving forward, that occasional check-in. Okay. Program that builds the housing snapshot, builds off the housing snapshot and the the housing CEA. Don't even know what my own acronym is. To identify opportunities to address local housing issues. Okay, so the next steps, this is from Extension, is how do we build a better profile to allow people to better understand what they're housing? When is too much data? Okay, one of the things that we have to be really clear about is that this is not a feasibility study. This is not the type of thing that a developer would come in and put pen to paper and figure out, is there a business plan for this particular development? That's not what we're doing. All we're doing is trying to get a handle on what are the strengths and weaknesses of the local housing market. Okay. Customized to meet local needs. One of the things that is inherent in the CEA process is that it can be customized to every community that you're working with. Okay. When Ron and Glenn were doing the original CEAs, they kind of said we never did the program the exact same in any two communities. Okay. They were kind of asked by a lot of colleagues in other states to try to write down what the CEA is. And Ron refused to do it. They said, if we write it down, it becomes a cookbook. And that program cannot be a cookbook. It has to be customized to fit every single community. Okay. Well, what do you think colleagues in other states reacted to that? They said, well, if you're not going to do it, we're going to do it. Hence, Take Charge was born. Okay. It's customized to meet local needs. And that's where the local knowledge of the county educator is vital to be able to breathe life into this kind of a program. Designed by local extension educators with support from UW Extension, okay, specialists and educators. How can we continue to evolve this thing over time? What works? What doesn't work? How can we modify this to make it more successful, more usable across Wisconsin communities? And I'll stop with that. So that's kind of the CEA program. It's built on the tradition of programs that have been around in Wisconsin for a number of decades, and it's been used in a number of other states. So there's kind of a proven track record here. The problem, though, is that we've got too much data. Okay? And I want to use all of it. The second is the Community Preparedness Index. Okay? When we test piloted this thing in Sauk City and Prairie du Sac, we made the mistake of going through every single question. That was a mistake. because it took up like almost 3 hours, which is more than what people agreed to do. We need to be a little bit more strategic on that. And the final is that a lot of the communities that have looked at this have found that it's really easy to kind of study the issue. It's really easy to talk about the issue. It's really hard to do something about the issue. And that's what the frustration that came out of Soft Prairie is that too many folks are saying, well, why don't we just have a developer come in and fill up these starter holes? Why don't we just get to the developer that will solve all our problems? That's not going to work. It wasn't going to work. It would have already happened. Okay. Second, and this is the one that gets me really frustrated, is you've got a lot of slumlords in the community. They've got really crappy housing. You've got building code. You have authority. Are you going to do anything about it? Oh, no, we can't do that. Well, why not? Well, that would create conflict. I'm getting my car and go back there. Okay. So there's this is kind of a work in progress, if you will. Questions, comments, complaints? No. You sound just like my students.
I have a question, Steve. Given the discussion from this morning, I mean, it was Kurt that sort of talked about a variety of different, there's soft markets, there's tight markets, there's sort of sweet spot markets. There's a lot of things that it's a mismatch between the price of a house and the income that a household might have, or the median household might be in a given place, community or county. I'm just curious from that conversation, have you thought about, and you said this is still a work in progress, the housing CEA. Is there any like revision that came to mind as you were watching or thinking about the presentations from this morning, or to either revise part of it or to reshape it to help?
Carl's been working on some occupation data and housing affordability issues from Apple. I think that we could do more in that regard. One of the things that was brought up this morning was stuff around Section 8. That is don't bring that up because it will stop it from being in its tracks. Okay? That's why I don't like to use the term affordable housing. I prefer the term starter homes, because affordable housing is the same kind of negative connotation as Section 8 housing. I think one of the things that I want to do is kind of see what kind of research we have out there about what does a typical Section 8 housing person look like. When I say that, I mean, are they the working poor? Okay. How many people in the community are eligible for Section 8 housing, but they're not taking it? So I think that we can kind of refine some of the pieces of data, some pieces of research that we should. Okay. But again, it's going to be kind of custom to every single community. But I see some holes in the data. Okay. I see some things that we're not really adequately addressing in the data. So now, rather than having 60 slides, we're going to have 80 slides. Okay. So that's.
So you talked about building codes, but when we're talking about local government particularly, I mean, does any of this address things like their zoning ordinances and their parking requirements and all of those sort of things that matter at the margins in terms of housing affordability? Because if you look at a lot of zoning codes, they're extraordinarily restrictive on multifamily or other types of sort of smaller, lower cost housing. Parking requirements are a huge issue. So those are areas where local governments have direct control over what can get built and can take fairly quick, relatively low cost action to do something. So when we're talking about housing affordability, we're always talking about all these like super complex federal programs and all this stuff that most of our rural communities don't have the capacity to manage, but they sure as hell can update their zoning code to allow for more low cost housing.
Exactly. And one of the things that's occurred in Wisconsin as it comes to landlords is the state has made it increasingly difficult for local municipalities to do anything about bad landlords, slumlords, if you will. Madison, you would think Madison would be on top of this stuff, right? There's one person that owns like 50 student housing, and they're falling apart. And they keep finding him and finding him, finding him, finding him, finding him. He doesn't do anything. You would think Madison would go in and, well, the state is taking away all that authority. So,
But as an economist who's marinating in data every day, how do you cut through that analysis paralysis that many communities I think find themselves in, because they feel like, oh, we just need to do a study, we just need to have the data. It's like, yeah, it's good, you know, we do need actionable information, you know, but we actually need action. So how do you work with communities to say, you know, this is all important stuff, but you guys need to do something about it?
this is where that kind of, that, you know, that final identified 3 to 5 things. One of which could be, well, we need to study this particular issue. Okay, good, that's on the list. What about these other things? And a lot of times, for a lot of communities, it's a simplistic little thing. Like saying, oh, we do have a program to help people, low-income folks do maintenance on their houses. Nobody knows about it. Okay, how can we, you know, that's low-hanging fruit. So how can we get the communities to grab some of that low-hanging fruit and move forward? Is that low-hanging fruit going to solve the housing problem? No, but it gives some momentum for the community to kind of build itself off of. And then parallel with that, we could be doing deeper data dives on specific issues.
Nice. One more question. So, like many different issues that we deal with in community, when we rely on like census data or whatever, these other federal sources, there's an issue with the validity or the accuracy of that data, given the size of the unit of analysis. I'm just curious, how do you navigate? Housing is a little different because I think that's an important piece. If you're a small place, you interact with other locations that are close by for the housing stock. But how do you deal with that particular piece to make it so people feel confident in the information that they're looking at is actually reflective of the reality of the crowd?
Matt, I go around and around and around. He insists on putting those confidence intervals, those standard errors in census estimates. I say, it's people. What people want to know is what do people know? It's like economic impact. So they have multiplier 1.5. 1.5 to want to have ballpark estimates. Now, that's why I'm saying that this is not, this is the equivalent stuff. This is not the kind of analysis that a developer would do, investing millions of dollars in something. Right? Then I'd start worrying about that. To engage the community in conversation, that average is close enough for conversation.
You're talking about data that's available. I got to think I was working with Matt years ago, and he introduced me to the data, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. Have you applied to that?
That's not that. That's one of the things that the team has had. It's not a team. We are not a team.
Nope, we're a group.
We are not a team.
We're a group.
My attention to this one here doesn't make a team. Some of you have all these people. We are not a team. We are
A group.
Okay. I forgot where I was going with that.
Loans that originated, who got them?
This is one of the problems that I think the group has had, is that housing is such a complex issue. You kind of walk up to the edge of the cliff, and you go, and you take a step back. Because to really get into that, I mean, you've got to go a whole lot of time to dive into it and jump off the cliff. And I think part of the problem that we've had is that a lot of the members have kind of moved up to the edge and went, because it's such a complex issue.
Well, and I will say that our strategy to deal with that, walking up to the edge, was to hold a symposium in which it would force some of us to develop something like this and some of the other two products you've seen, but also to bring in folks like Kirk and Kirk and Tom to provide more information, more education, more research, so that we all can learn from that, so that we have a little bit more comfort level getting closer to that edge. So the symposium is meant to not just be a reflection of, hey, what can we do? It's about like, what could we do? So.
I mean, housing is such a big umbrella topic that there are so many different parts of it that different communities are struggling with those different parts. And so you start getting into the topic of housing, it's a little bit actually what I mean is affordable housing. What I'm talking about is conditional housing and home ownership. And it's just so varied that it's hard for all of us to get on sort of the same page of what do we do for analysis, because every community is different.
And that's why the data analysis for the CEA is supposed to be at like 30,000 foot. How to get to thinking, and maybe the data backs up their preconceived ideas, maybe it challenges their ideas if they're thinking. Maybe it kind of goes, geez, I hadn't thought of it this way, then it's been successful. Right? But you're right, I mean, it's you fall into this paralysis by analysis, because maybe you do want to tackle a specific issue and you got to think real deep into it. And not just from do that.
Real quick, when you're talking about actual community taking the initiative, in Monroe, we did look at code enforcement and rezoning and everything about 4 or 5 years ago. But the city did make the smart decision to say, we need to clean up our own code regulations before we start asking the community. So that I think is a trigger point for a lot of communities. But I was very proud that we took that action first. Now that we've done some of our own cleanup, then we started the code enforcement letters saying these are your violations, but we also backed that up with a curb appeal project. So if you were low income level and you were a homeowner occupied, we could give you a grant of $25,000 to correct code enforcement. That has been very well received. I think we have 16 or 17 applicants, and we just released it at the beginning of April.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I think a lot of communities get frustrated with, because it's a big issue. There is no magic bullet. So the way that would happen is we're doing a low stuff here, a low stuff here, a low stuff here, a low stuff here, but the big issue is still there.
Right.
So after 2 years of doing this, you gotta go, we haven't made any progress. And this is where a county educator can step in and go, look at all the stuff we've accomplished. So it's, and I think successful communities appreciate these small steps moving forward.
Thank you, Dr. Diller.
Thank you.